My guest today is Dr. Sam Impey, a sports scientist at Mitchelton Scott supporting World Tour men, women, and continental cycling teams. In addition, Sam conducts research to support performance outcomes at Edith Cowan University. Sam, really appreciate you taking the time today.
Hi, Mark. Yeah, great. Thanks for having me on.
Fantastic. Well, I can't wait to dive into talking about fueling for endurance training and the key role that glycogen plays in this whole story. But before we jump into that, could you tell listeners a little bit more about your background and journey to the position that you're currently in?
Yeah, sure. So I did my undergraduate, master's, and PhD at Liverpool John Moores. 10 really good years in Liverpool, and kind of obviously with the background of practitioners and lecturers that you've got working at that institution, guys like James Morton, Graham Close. I kind of came into the area of sort of sports nutrition as I moved through my kind of undergrad program and master's program. And then, had the opportunity to go and do a PhD with James, looking at carbohydrate manipulation around exercise and how that affected some of the molecular markers of training adaptation. And so really jumped on the opportunity to do that and combine two real passions I had, which was kind of the area of molecular, some more kind of practically relevant nutrition interventions. So I did that, and then I did a postdoc at Liverpool as well, looking at glycogen use during training and to try and match up some of the work that we did with the PhD. And then subsequently to that, took another postdoc in the University of Birmingham, where I looked at using some 13C tracers to measure exogenous oxidation of some different carbohydrates. And now, as you said, working at Edith Cowan University, but kind of in a split position between there and Mitchelton Scott, kind of supporting their World Tour guys.
Fantastic. Well, maybe we can kick off this discussion here today by zooming back out to 30,000 feet and maybe giving listeners a quick whirlwind tour of the sports science, as it relates to carbs and endurance training over the last, half decade since the 1960s to give folks a bit of a foundation here before we dive into today's topic.
Yeah, sure. I mean, start off with a really easy question. Only 50 years of research, hey?
Go for it.
I think, as you say, probably a pretty good place to start. I mean, the kind of, I guess, the first real examination of how carbohydrate or specifically glycogen is involved in exercise and how it kind of has maybe effects on performance was done back in the mid to late 60s by some of the guys in with Bengt Saltine and Holtman and Bergstrom, and those guys are kind of around 66, 67, where they actually took the first kind of biopsies from skeletal muscle, and actually with the intention of measuring glycogen content. So and they kind of showed a pretty tight correlation very early on, very strong correlation between muscle glycogen and performance, or certainly the ability to sustain performance, in that guys who had lower muscle glycogen couldn't run for as long as the guys who had higher muscle glycogen, and they manipulated that by changing their diet as well. So
yep.
It's kind of interesting though that actually like that work in terms of its relation to exercise was only kind of really started almost exactly 100 years after glycogen was first discovered. So
wow.
It's kind of an interesting one. It was left alone for a long time before its kind of relation to exercise was picked up, and then from that a lot of the papers on it really kind of skyrocketed, the number of papers being published on it. And you have some of the guys like Eddie Coyle, then, who worked kind of throughout the 80s, or certainly in the mid to late 80s, kind of showing how much, what the relationship was between the changes in substrate utilization with feeding, and how that could potentially spare muscle glycogen, and kind of asking the questions around, how, or kind of showing how preservation of muscle glycogen, either by feeding before or during exercise, really seem to tie into beneficial performance effects, I guess. And that was kind of really fundamental in starting to drive the real interest in looking at the optimum way to drive things like exogenous carbohydrate oxidation. So in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s, you had guys like Asker Ukendrup and all of the guys that he worked with, really looking at the combinations of sugars and the amounts and dose and timing to provide exogenous sources of fuel in, hopefully to preserve muscle glycogen and minimize the onset of fatigue or exercise termination or sustained performance. So I guess that's kind of where we're getting towards where we are now. And I think a few years ago they kind of reached a point where after all that research showing that more carbohydrate was good, it kind of naturally reached a point where a lot of the recommendations were to have just high carbohydrate all the time, before, during, and after to try and maximize muscle glycogen, 24/7. But then, as kind of, I think a little bit more research was done and also practitioners started to get involved, kind of around about 2010, you started seeing these slightly more bespoke recommendations, I guess, in terms of, scaling carbohydrate according to body mass, for example. So we always talk about grams per kilo body mass now, and also looking at how you should maybe scale the carbohydrate intake based on the sort of intensity and duration of training. So like a really good example of that is Louise Burke's 2010 paper, which I think the title's Carbohydrates for Training and Competition. So it's provides a really good kind of overview, or earlier kind of one of the first examples of how people started to really start thinking about it as maybe being a little bit more specific instead of just, heaps of carbohydrates all the time, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah, the blanket sort of statement. And of course, as you mentioned, they're deliberately training with reduced carbohydrate availability to enhance some of these endurance adaptations. I.e., the Trainlow, compete high paradigm here is definitely a hot topic in the sports nutrition world, at your level, and also in the sort of blogosphere, if you will, or on the internet. So maybe we can start off here by, could you define the terms carbohydrate availability and Trainlow?
Yeah. I think the easiest one to do, the easiest one, I guess, is start with carbohydrate availability. And I guess what the definition that we put forward in our sports med paper last year was, we'd probably say that carbohydrate availability is the sum of the endogenous, so the store of muscle and liver glycogen, plus the exogenous carbohydrate, so the carbohydrate consumed before and during exercise, for example, that's available to kind of sustain the required intensities and durations of training. So it's that combination of what's already inside the body and also what you put in, in the immediate period before and during exercise, that's available for utilization. So I think that's kind of a pretty simple and pretty easy to understand definition of what we try to term as carbohydrate availability.
Fantastic, and that's definitely one where we're getting some nuance here of when you go from recreational athletes to more competitive recreational to elite, and how things change in terms of the amount of carbohydrate needed to really perform some of these training bouts. And if we talk about Trainlow, what does that mean to get all the listeners here on the same page?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess then when we go into kind of Trainlow, I think there's this again kind of maybe comes towards some nuanced stuff as well. So my definition would be training with a reduced amount of carbohydrate. Now, the interesting thing around that is that can actually be done or looked at in a couple of different ways, I guess. So, for example, you could intentionally deplete muscle glycogen and liver glycogen, either with an exercise bout or by changing your diet. And then before a specific exercise session, then undertake that exercise session with reduced muscle glycogen. But actually then, if you fed carbohydrate during that session, what you're doing is you're not compromising the ability to complete the exercise session because you're feeding carbohydrates. So even though you have low muscle glycogen availability, you may still have adequate carbohydrate availability because of what you put in. And then that also works in the flip side, that actually if you start an exercise session with relatively kind of medium or high muscle glycogen, but the duration is long enough or the intensity is high enough without kind of putting in any exogenous carbohydrates, you can actually reach a state of training in a low carbohydrate state, even though you started with relatively normal or slightly above normal muscle glycogen concentrations. So I think when you think about it like that, you actually see that there is kind of a slightly more nuance to exactly what Trainlow is than just kind of one definition per se. So and that was actually summarized kind of pretty well in a paper that James and Louise and Trent Stellingworth actually published. I think it's towards the back end of last year or early this year.
Absolutely, yeah. You did a great job as well in your paper, and of course Trent and company in their recent paper. And you discuss how carbohydrate restriction can potentially enhance some of these exercise nutrient-sensitive cell signaling pathways that regulate mitochondrial adaptations. So maybe for the listeners, we can give an example here of, perhaps we could start with, fasted training. Can you walk listeners through what's happening at the cellular level and potentially in terms of performance adaptations?
Yeah, sure. So I guess when we look at fasted training, this would be the context where you'd have obviously a low or no exogenous, so you're not obviously going to feed carbohydrates before you do a fasted training session. But what you'll also have is you'll have kind of relatively low liver glycogen concentration because the liver sustains blood glucose. You have a minimum a minimum dose of blood glucose that's required to sustain the CNS, so that comes from the liver. But what you could actually have is potentially have a high or relatively high muscle glycogen, depending on what you'd eaten the evening before. So there's already a couple of nuances around kind of some of the stuff we were talking about there, that your liver glycogen is likely to be kind of fairly low, but your muscle glycogen could be relatively high. And then if you don't feed any exogenous carbohydrates, then you're obviously kind of creating that kind of low carbohydrate scenario that way. And interestingly, I think what you see a lot with fasted training and just generally from exercising, certainly without intake of any carbohydrates, is that when the liver is low in glycogen, you naturally get a big spike in circulatory free fatty acids. So particularly this is even more potent when you add the exercise stimulus on top. So what you do is you kind of change that circulatory environment. So you get a big increase in free fatty acids or lipid breakdown peripherally, which increases the free fatty acid availability in the blood, which can then be taken up and used by the muscles for an energy source, assuming the intensity is appropriate for that. And so by changing the fuel or by changing the contribution of the fuel that the muscle uses during exercise, you then change the way that the muscle adapts to that exercise session. So in this context, you're increasing the fat utilization during exercise. And what that tends to do is increase the gene response for proteins that are involved in fat transport and oxidation, for example. So we see a lot of the kind of the studies that have looked at fasted training tend to see an increase in the gene responses for CPT1 and beta oxidation proteins, so transport and oxidation of fats as a kind of as an artifact of shifting the fuel, the predominant fuel that's available for energy, or certainly that's coming into the cell during that type of fasted training. So whether you get kind of really, I don't know that the cellular adaptations in terms of like the potency of the stimulus is as great as some of the other kind of typical Trainlow methodologies. For example, the severity of the challenge on homeostasis isn't as great as some of the others. So it's not so much of the sledgehammer effect, I guess, is maybe a good way to look at it. But
that's well said. I had Trent Stellingworth on last season on the podcast, and he was mentioning, in the elite Kenyan runners, sort of a traditional thing would obviously be, whether it was just by because it was just easier for them to do in terms of historically, but getting up, having a tea or coffee, and going out for long runs, marathon distance training runs in a totally fasted state with just a small bout of caffeine there. And interestingly, obviously in France as well, I'd lived in France, in the south of France, for a year, and some of the history there around some of the cycling. Is that a strategy that you would use at the elite level today, or is that sort of a holdover from some of the historical practices from the past?
No, I think it's something I'm still quite a big fan of using with the guys that I work with and with teams I've worked with previously. I think I tend to think of it as being like it's like a tool you have in your toolbox. So we use kind of periodization of training. Why don't we use periodization of nutrition around that, given that we know you can alter the metabolic state and the responses of skeletal muscle to training by manipulating some of the nutrition. I think when you think about it that way, it's kind of it just kind of comes back to what tools do you have at your disposal to bring about the adaptations that you want. And for me, fasted training, as you say, kind of is historically kind of quite well understood, maybe conceptually slightly misunderstood as to how maybe is best to do it. There can be compromising effects, but
for sure,
yeah, I think it has a really useful place in modern sports nutrition.
And is there a certain exercise bout that it's best placed with in terms of as an aerobic session more appropriate when you're doing that type of fasted training? Is it really just a matter of what you're trying to elicit in the athlete?
Yeah, exactly right. I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's what you're trying to elicit in the athlete. For me personally, I think it's kind of good to do your, I guess, what you call base aerobic type work with. You can incorporate fasted training into that relatively easily. Fasted training is one where you can actually push intensity a little bit more than you can do with some of the other more intense kind of carbohydrate manipulation type strategies. So if you just, as I'm sure you know yourself with the guys that you work with, there are some people who just prefer exercising in the morning on an empty stomach.
For sure. Yep.
So if you have guys like that and actually they want to just get up and have some coffee or some water or something and go and do an interval type session, as long as it's not going to be probably in excess of 45 minutes to maybe even an hour of higher intensity work, and if that suits them, then maybe that's a good way to do it, and you can maybe support that with some protein or that kind of stuff.
And Sam, if we zoom out a little bit here to sort of the recreational endurance athlete who's also oftentimes trying to lose a bit of weight and improve some dysglycemia or dyslipidemia, do you have a preference in terms of adding in potentially more fasted training for these types of folks, or not being afraid of it in a sense to help elicit some of those gains, or is that again specific to the individual?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, personally, I think it really has a really useful place. I think there's some kind of depending on the type of person, there's probably there's so if you have guys who are not like kind of categorically unfit, but kind of fairly sedentary and
somewhere in between,
kind of
right?
yeah, like kind of slightly overweight and that kind of stuff, then I think just going from doing nothing to doing something, you're going to get huge effects whatever you do. But as you say, with the slightly more kind of recreational active groups, I think that's where you start to see benefits of kind of putting in slightly more specific, slightly more contextual things like fast training and that sort of stuff. So and in that context, I think that there is a real benefit to doing faster training. I know there's a study, you must excuse me, I can't remember the name of the first author, but I know they did, they had guys do like 100 minutes of aerobic work every day, and they had one group do it all in the morning, one group do it all in the evening, and one group do 50 in the morning and 50 in the evening. And the group that lost the most amount of fat was the group that did their 100 minutes fasted in the morning. So it's only one study that kind of comes to mind, and I'm sure there's plenty of arguments to do it the other way. But for me, I think you create the right metabolic environment. Excuse me. And it's not a huge deviation in people's lifestyles to get up and go and do it, so much as maybe trying to introduce a completely new exercise or that kind of stuff.
Terrific. Yeah, definitely. Very, very well said. And, if we look then at a different strategy, in terms of 2-a-day training, back to that sort of elite endurance athlete, how do things change with respect to glycogen levels and cellular adaptations when we look at athletes performing 2-a-day sessions?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So I guess the first real indicator or the first real study that set out to look at kind of intentionally using twice per day training to manipulate, or as the potential to manipulate training adaptations was done back in 2005 by Bengt Saltin's group and the first authors Hansen. So they used a classic Copenhagen model, so it's like a leg kicking exercise, and they kind of really showed that actually if you intentionally do sort of 50% of your training, so the second session of the day, with low glycogen availability, they got an increase in kind of some of the enzymes involved in beta oxidation, as well as the content of COX proteins, some of the mitochondrial proteins, and they saw an improvement in performance. Now, that's obviously in leg kicking and not necessarily a true artifact of what elite athletes do. Mm-hmm. And so, from a cellular perspective, I think you're by doing twice a day training, you're increasing it's a way to increase the stress on the second session is maybe a good way to think about it. And so what you want to do is perturb homeostasis as relatively as much as possible, and actually by creating an additional metabolic stress by reducing glycogen content. It's a way to do that without requiring any further intensity or duration or additional mechanical stress that you'd have to create if you did it in a state of of high muscle glycogen, as it were. So when you look at it that way, you kind of go, okay, well, it makes sense. But there are a couple of caveats to that, in that you kind of traditionally and typically you always see compromised absolute training intensity. So you need to be pretty strategic about what the type of second session is going to be. So ideally, it would be kind of higher intensity work in the first session, and then maybe lower intensity and a more sort of sustained kind of base aerobic type session for the second one. So because you don't want to compromise the quality of the training. So if you can fit that into to your program, and then you want to use it that way, then that's great, and you can create, as I said, that additional metabolic stress by reducing muscle glycogen. But The other thing to kind of take away from that is that actually, well, it's kind of difficult to necessarily to pick out whether that stress is purely from reducing or having reduced muscle glycogen. It could also be like an effect of energy deficit, for example. But then you also have the kind of compounding effects of, well, you're actually stacking exercise sessions, training sessions in pretty close sort of temporal proximity. And so you're naturally going to have altered the environment that you start the second session in, even if you are in in addition to being in a lower glycogen state. So it's still quite difficult to pick out, exactly what the driving factor between those enhanced, certainly cellular effects are. And it's for me, that's I like it when I hear people say that, because that to me says that's a great reason to do more research on this topic and
Absolutely.
to really look into it.
Yeah, it is fascinating stuff, and that idea, as you mentioned, of that initial training session being more of a high intensity session, following that with sort of protein meal with dietary fats and limited to no carbohydrates, so that second session you're starting with that low muscle glycogen availability, and of course doing an aerobic session on the back end of that, and being able to then elicit some of these adaptations. And as you so rightly mentioned, is it the carbohydrate? Is it the energy deficit? Is it the stacking of the sessions back to back that's eliciting some of this? It is, pretty fascinating stuff. And if we dovetail into, another type of strategy here, which is the sleep low, train low strategy, could you,
Sure.
which is a whole other area here, could you define this strategy for listeners and, once again discuss how things shift here with this type of train low strategy?
Yeah, for sure. So I think this is kind of, I think we've probably gone through, maybe the, I mentioned kind of fasting is the sort of the least sort of intense intervention. I think twice per day training is pretty tough. And then I think sleep low, train low is your kind of your sledgehammer, your hardest level in my opinion anyway. So, and this is where, so what you do is you would intentionally lower muscle glycogen in the evening of the first day, however you did that with, either interval session or an extended training session. So the idea is to really bring muscle glycogen down pretty low. You then have a kind of protein-only meal, maybe some, as well, maybe some dietary fats and some fiber, that kind of stuff. And try and rehydrate a little bit. Then you go to bed, and then you get up in the morning, and then you do a fasted session. So, you train without having had any carbohydrates. Again, the next morning. And so what this does is, if you think about the time duration that you're in a low glycogen state with twice per day training, you're maybe in a low glycogen state for maybe 2 to 5 hours. Whereas with sleep low, train low, what we're doing is putting you in a low glycogen and low energy state for maybe closer to 12 to 18 hours. So we're extending that energetic stress prior to starting the second exercise session. So and this kind of tends to have a lot of the same effects. We see a lot of the same responses that you see with fasted training and with twice per day training. But certainly, I think the responses, and it's using sleep methodology that's had the biggest impact or the biggest translation into performance effects, for example. So there seems to be something about the way that it's manipulated that kind of seems to translate better into performance outcomes than the twice per day training or the fasted training, for example. So there's a whole load of possibilities as to what it could be. And I think that's probably another 2 or 3 hours of podcasts to get into that one. So.
For sure. And I was going to say, just to kind of dip our toe into that, is it the absolute amount of glycogen deficit then? I mean, obviously you guys have proposed the glycogen threshold hypothesis. Is there something there with reducing muscle glycogen, of course, liver through the night with the fasting that's impacting this? Or where can you comment without making too deep of a rabbit hole for us here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, as you mentioned, the glycogen threshold that we proposed was kind of based off when we went back and looked through a lot of the literature, or all the literature, I should say, actually, that had been done where researchers had manipulated glycogen availability and prior to exercise, and had matched guys either, some sessions high, some sessions low. We kind of looked at where the glycogen values were that we tended to see those augmented responses, and whether that was looking at signaling kinases, whether that was looking at the increase in COX proteins or PDK4, gene transcription, or actually whether it was also looking at kind of some more fundamental physiology, like things like calcium release, and the activation of things like P70S6K involved in protein synthesis. What we actually tended to see was that a lot of these responses that were associated with training with training in a low glycogen state tended to fall within a relatively narrow window of absolute muscle glycogen. So,
Interesting.
What we tended to see was that once you got below 300 millimoles, that's millimoles of glycogen per kilogram of muscle mass, measured at dry weight. So you sometimes see wet weight reported and dry weight reported. This is we converted all of it to dry weight for that. Actually, once you got under 300 millimoles and down to about 100, was where most of these kind of augmented physiological and cellular responses tended to happen. So it was kind of, it was really interesting that actually across, kind of 15 years of research, when we picked back through the data, that it was pretty consistently kind of within this region. Once you get below 100 millimoles of muscle glycogen, that tends to be the point of fatigue. There aren't many people who can push below that. That seems to be a pretty consistent cutoff. You'll kind of, generally speaking, if you see higher VO2s, you might be able to see guys who get down to kind of 80 or 60. But generally speaking, 100's a pretty consistent cutoff for the maintenance of exercise. So, but yeah, between those two figures, so the kind of upper level being 300 and the lower level being 100 millimoles of glycogen, we consistently saw these augmented responses. So that kind of what drove our idea of this potential this glycogen threshold. So this kind of window in which if you can spend a portion of your training inside this window, that we actually believe that you'd get these augmented responses.
Yeah, it's incredible insights. And of course, you mentioned the critically low post-exercise being that 100 millimoles. Is there, if someone doesn't have access to a lab, is there some practical way that they could, whether it's symptoms or exercise, know if they're approaching that sort of threshold, or is that something that they would need to have some testing done to be able to determine?
The simplest answer is no.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the reason that this area is very difficult to research, because you need to take chunks of muscle out of people. So it's very difficult to research in elite people for that reason. But it's also why it's probably pretty difficult to begin to apply without having like a a pretty deep understanding of the glycolytic demands of your sport and the kind of nutritional habits and the nutrition of your athletes. I mean, to answer your question, like if you get down to 100 millimoles, like you'd probably know because you'd be a horrible person to be around.
For sure.
It'd
be pretty tough to keep going, and
exactly, yeah. Like if you're getting RPEs of 18 and 19 without much of an increase in heart rate,
you're pretty cooked.
For a minimal increase in exercise intensity, like perceptually, like if you're really kind of pretty cooked, then you're probably not far off. That is not my sound, but just anecdotally from where we've done this in studies, that's what you see. But kind of doing it practically and how you apply this, I guess, that at this stage, I don't think there's any. I don't really think there's any solid technologies out there that allow us to non-invasively measure muscle glycogen. Once we can do that, it'll certainly open up a lot more doors and avenues to make this applicable. Or maybe we'll have a much better grasp of maybe actually this doesn't work and it's just an artifact of something else that we were doing, and we just kind of slightly missed the goalposts there. But I think that's the interesting thing. I think you have to be open about all these questions and really be honest about what we can comfortably and convincingly do at this stage.
Yeah, that's terrific. And Sam, for listeners who aren't as familiar in this area, we've been talking cyclists. If they're a runner or a marathon runner, would this type of fueling strategies, would they apply as well to these folks? And then also another question that dovetails there is around team sports. What are some potential applications here in team sports?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, Trent Stellingworth published a fantastic case study of kind of carbohydrate periodization in 3 elite marathon runners back in 2012. Which is a really, really excellent review, excellent case study, excuse me. I think when you look at that, as well as looking at kind of some of the supernova projects that Louise Burke's running in race walking, I don't think that this just holds true in, although most of the research has been done in cyclists and triathletes, but obviously using the bike component of triathlon to measure some of the outputs. I think when you look at that, there's probably huge application, certainly in most linear energetics, I guess would probably be the easiest way to put it. Mm-hmm. I think there's clear application there for sure. As you say, when you move through to team sports, it becomes a lot more interesting. I think it probably becomes a lot more complex as well, which is cool. So you have, obviously, within team sports, you obviously have a greater diversity of physiological characteristics, even within the same team, for example. So like my background's rugby, so I kind of always gravitate towards that and think, well, if you've got a 130 kilo prop forward versus a 90 kilo winger, their physiological characteristics and what determines their capacity to be very good at their sport are two very different things. Mm-hmm. So when you look at it like that, you then go, okay, yeah, actually periodizing carbohydrate in that context is now even more important to take it into an athlete specific recommendation as opposed to any kind of general recommendation, But I think it's definitely applicable. I mean, fundamentally, you're manipulating energy availability, so that obviously has immediate impact on, looking after body composition or body weight, for example, just straight off the bat. And then, hopefully, if you can dial in some additional sessions to maybe boost some of those adaptations from an aerobic perspective, then I think that's great, as long as it fits within the context of.
Absolutely, and And Sam, obviously a term that's used now synonymously with elite endurance exercise is that idea of fuel for the work required. And a great quote from your paper reads, "The question that emerges is not how much an athlete can supercompensate glycogen stores, but rather, does the athlete's diet contain enough carbohydrate to maintain training intensity while also creating a consistent metabolic milieu conducive to facilitating training adaptations?" Now, we've sort of been talking about this throughout this entire podcast, but this might be a nice way to kind of sum things up for listeners. Can you sort of summarize or unpack that statement a little bit for listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this actually came from this idea was that we certainly weren't the first ones to make this observation. I'll need to. I think it says that in the paper as well. So we actually came across a paper from 1981 by Sherman and colleagues there, and they actually looked at half marathon running, and they did a glycogen loading protocol prior to that. So they had guys either do like a real high and extended duration glycogen load, or do like a kind of a more tapered medium approach, and then just a shorter load at the end. And kind of what they noticed actually was that even though they had some guys start with, so I'll give you the context because we were talking about millimoles of glycogen before. So the guys who did this real high sustained carbohydrate load started this half marathon with 800 millimoles of muscle glycogen. So that's getting pretty close to the upper limits of what's been reported in the literature as being possible to store. Whereas they had another condition where they had a group of guys who started with like 625 millimoles, so a considerable reduction, but still a good amount of muscle glycogen. And actually, what they saw was that they both ran about 83 minutes for a half marathon, and actually the guys who who started with 625 millimoles actually ran a little bit quicker than, although not statistically significant, but actually ran a little bit quicker than the guys who started with 800 millimoles. And that's kind of where, they in that paper, even back in 1981, they made that observation that, and there's a quote in the paper that kind of says something like, there's anything above a minimum level of muscle glycogen may be unnecessary for specific exercise durations and intensities. And so, when we come back to that, and we kind of go, well, actually, do we need all this glycogen all the time? And maybe by overcompensating it, maybe we're dampening some of those effects, and maybe it's about, if we can tailor it and make it more specific, then maybe we're onto more of an appropriate way to fuel our athletes.
Incredible stuff that, almost 40 years ago, they were putting their finger on some of this stuff is really, really fascinating. And Sam, where do you think, in terms of elite performance here, you obviously work in elite endurance performance, what's the evolution of research in this area over the next 5 or 10 years, do you think?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question. I think, personally, what I would like to see is, people looking at graded, if we can grade muscle glycogen levels starting prior to exercise. So, if you could find a way to have guys begin exercise with 200 millimoles, then this, a week later we could start them with 400, 600, 800, whatever, and see if we can pick out if there is if you do actually see these augmented responses with differing levels of muscle glycogen, to try and unpack, is there a glycogen threshold? I guess that would be, for me, that would be pretty interesting. I kind of, along with that as well, I think there's a whole load more needs to be done on how you apply carbohydrate periodization with athletes. So there's some work coming out from the supernova projects where they show how they actually manipulated the carbohydrate around training, and that's obviously great, and that's one way of doing it. But maybe there's actually 4 or 5 different ways to manipulate glycogen strategically, or manipulate carbohydrate or energy availability strategically around training that will elicit more or less beneficial effects. And that's probably sport specific as well. So, it would be awesome to see kind of people producing case studies or case reports of how they've actually applied this in different sports, and how those, what those outcomes were, for example. So, I think that's kind of immediately, a real kind of. I think there's also things like, particularly when you get up to the elite level, certainly, or these guys with real high VO2 maxes, is that a lot of the research and a lot of the molecular biology that's been done on it has been based on looking at mitochondrial biogenesis. But actually, it's once you get above a fairly kind of critical VO2 max level, then actually mitochondria, the capacity for your skeletal muscle to hold mitochondria is pretty limited. So you're not really going to be building any more mitochondria per se. So a lot of the kind of transcription factors and transcriptional coactivators that are involved or measured in looking at these from a mitochondrial biogenesis perspective are actually involved in the targeted degradation of mitochondria by autophagy, so what's termed mitophagy. So actually, maybe in that context, what we're looking at is more the degradation of less functional components of the mitochondrial reticulum, and then the synthesis to replace those. So maybe it's actually a function of mitochondrial quality as opposed to just more mitochondria per se that's manifesting a training response. Again, that's just entirely speculation on my part, but I think it'd be super interesting to kind of see how that avenue maybe develops over the next few years as well. So, maybe we don't just need to measure an increase in stuff all the time. Maybe it's more about measuring the quality of what we have, and that'll tell us more about the effectiveness of our interventions on improving performance.
Yeah, that's really, really, again, fascinating stuff. Obviously, seemingly highly plausible as well. That idea of quality would be so important. So, Sam, I really appreciate you carving out some time today. This has been fantastic. Terrific insights as usual. Where can people stay connected with all your terrific work and keep up with your research?
Well, yeah, thank you very much. It's been cool to be on. I'm on Twitter at SamImpey _. I kind of use that for a lot of the work stuff. And then I'm on PubMed and ResearchGate as well. So those are probably the best places to find me and get hold of me.
Fantastic. We'll definitely include those links and some of the papers we discussed here in the show notes at Dr.